the go live button, which means theoretically we are now live to the people.
Right.
Yeah, hooray!
Hello.
Yeah, so right, that means eventually, and in some capacity, we're going to get confirmations from the many people in the chat that we are live, that they can hear our voices, which is always good. But anyway, Kevin, yeah, thanks for coming along. We're going to talk about pacers. It should be quite fun. All right, and tell you what, let me do this and say, welcome everyone. Hello, Dr. Kevin Tennent is here. Hello, Kevin. Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, hello everyone. It's going to be a fun episode tonight, I think, because everyone loves to hate or hates to love, or a combination of thereof, or loves to love and loves to hate on the haters of pacers. So we're going to talk about them because, well, for all sorts of reasons. But as with lots of minutiae, I think this is something that yourself, Kevin, and Dr. DT, who is on. Hi, David. I know you're watching. This is something that we've talked about before, which is that the little microcosm stories often end up being really useful ways to just look at the broader structure and the way that the railways work, or indeed broader society, frankly. But certainly when it comes to railways, little microcosms, often myths, and the things that get bolted onto them are quite interesting. So, yeah, I mean, we are going to talk about the pacer, but, and we're also going to let you formally introduce yourself. But before, in fact, you know what? Let's do that now. Dr. Kevin Tennant, tell the good people who you are before we jump into the news.
Well, my sort of day job is being a lecturer or senior lecturer in management at the University of York, basically. So my sort of day job is teaching students about management strategy and, well, I would say how to run organisations, but that's probably being a bit too grand, but it's sort of area. And then my kind of research area is kind of business and management history, really. And we look at the sort of history of organisations and that kind of thing. And obviously railways are a good organisation to look at. They're complicated, they're
messy, complicated, chaotic, prone to... Yeah. So what percentage of railway and other business history do you find yourself, organizational history rather, do you find, like, what's the ratio do you find?
Well, in terms of what I do, maybe about a third of it, something like that. I started with, in terms of transport history, I started with trams, which has been kind of well storied elsewhere, but then, we kind of got into, this area. I'll sort of kind of blame David, but it was partly my idea too, because what we were interested in was, well, this kind of thing about, well, how did pacers end up being something that were kind of so divisive, really?
Absolutely, yeah. I hope you don't mind that I've got you down as a business historian and also a pacer dream smasher there. That's just to summarise. But no, so I remember coming to the presentation with yourself and David giving over in kind of the faraway magical campus, the far end of York. And I knew what was brewing up because I think I'd already spoken to both of you already in the pub at some point. And it was a really fascinating, and much of what we're going to cover in this, much of the information in here comes from that research. When you kind of built on it, there's a bit more come out of it. This should be really interesting for everyone. And it's going to be data driven. So lots of we all like to basically look at the evidence when it comes to these things, these myths. I've done myth busting about Woodhead. I've done myth busting about the Great Central Railway. Actually, I've not done a Great Central Railway episode of Railnatter, but I mentioned it in the Woodhead episode. But these are some of the great railway myths, and pacers fall into one of these categories of like this mythos that's kind of detached from reality. So we're going to kind of bust all that today, I think. But before we do that, I'm going to press this button here because it's time to do the news. First news item. Actually, before we do the news, I always look at the COVID transport trends, and not much has changed really. We're kind of, given that lockdown, I mean, maybe we'll see a bit of a rise. Here you can see rail, kind of bouncing around at about 40% of pre-COVID ridership. Road is kind of at 95%, maybe. Cycling is basically back where it was pre-COVID, which is really depressing. Bus services are kind of at 60% and rising. So what's interesting is bus services are a reasonably good proxy to understand where rail's going to be in sort of like a month or so. It seems to be about the offset. So, different use cases, but kind of broadly, lots of us have been theorising as to why buses, certainly in the early days, why there is this difference in buses compared to rail. All sorts of things at play. Anyway, there we go. Those are those numbers. Not much interesting going on at the moment. Just a steady climb. More interesting, perhaps, is
Jones of
is this excerpt from the House of Lords.
There's nothing really new in this review. Because, of course, electrification has always been a cleaner option. And as I never tire of saying so, the Green Party has been saying this for 30 or 40 years. So why hasn't the government taken this as a matter of urgency?
You can't hear this, Kevin.
And doing it
No, I've got no
faster?
idea what she's saying, but hopefully it's good.
I'd like to take this opportunity to remind the House that the Green Party is the
I'm just going to to just kind of summarise. This is a discussion that was happening as a result of the RIA rail electrification report that we went through in a rail natter. Was it last time? Buses last time. The time before. This is in the House of Lords, the other place. They're discussing. Well, Jenny Jones, esteemed Jenny Jones, just stood up and in a very sort of sneery way said, I'll remind everyone that the Green Party have been saying, talking about electrifying railways for 30 to 40 years, which to be fair is true, but also I'm afraid she's set herself up for an owning by Baroness Veer here, for better or worse. Baroness Veer is just about to point something out, which is
against HS2, a position which I remain a little confused by.
I kind of paused it halfway through the punchline there, which is basically she says, yeah, the Green Party oppose HS2, which is completely baffling. But so that's the gag. Sorry, Jenny Jones, you set yourself up for that. More importantly is the bit we're about to hear. So everyone listen very carefully to this.
But the noble lady is quite right that now is the opportunity to put our shoulder to the wheel and to electrify our railways as quickly as we can.
Sorry, Kevin, I realise you've just got total radio silence. I've yet to work out how to make sound from this go to you. She's about to say the words rolling programme, which is very exciting.
That is why we will be setting out a rolling programme in the forthcoming RNEP. That is why we take great heed in what was written by the Network Rail-led Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy.
Fair play. She also just cited the Network Rail TDNS, the Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy, by name, without garbling it too much. So kind of fair play to that one. I haven't looked at Baroness Veer's voting record, given her allegiances, probably particularly dubious. But it is good. It's reassuring to see her kind of going through that, which is good. So rolling programme of electrification will be included in the overall decarbonisation plan.
That's not government policy, but it's got some very important conclusions therein, which we are looking at, and we'll be putting them in the transport decarbonisation.
So there we go. Sorry about that, Kev, because Kevin, you didn't hear any of that. However, it's good news, so it's worth having it here. So, rolling programme, actually mentioned by government, or at least a government representative in the Lords. So that's positive news. Right, anyway, enough of people talking and you not being able to hear them. The other big news is actually embargoed until tonight, but everyone knows what's happening, which is because it's been reported repeatedly by everyone, which is that Great British Railways is going to come into existence as of the next time. So you can see here we've got a nice picture of a bin, and it's empty. And then we've got a nice picture of the Railways Act 1993. And they combine those two and you get a bin with stuff in it. And yeah, so the RA 93 is getting binned. It was a dreadful piece of legislation. I'm interested to see what this new document will do, whether it'll talk about some things that I expect it not to. We're going to be talking about it next week in next episode because it's getting released tomorrow. So we'll find out. If they release the PDF so I can read through it, it'll be next week's episode, theoretically. Anyway, so yeah. So it's going to be called Great British Railways. It will use Rail Alphabet 2. It will use the corporate identity symbol. So we will have that. Although the name is awful. I'm sure there's a better name that's more compressed and kind of covers this better. Anyway, I don't know. Maybe it's just me. I can't remember. Anyway, so what else is in the news? Oh yeah, did you see this, Kevin? This is quite interesting. This was actually from the news last week, but I just couldn't squeeze it in. Which is that the competition winner for the network, and it ties into the previous news actually as well about branding. And it's the Network Rail standard station design. And I quite like this. I think it looks quite contemporary and fine.
Yeah.
I actually wasn't. I didn't hate the old British Rail standard station. I mean, it wasn't hugely inspiring. You know, you see them in places. I don't know where are some good examples like Trent Valley, and I don't know well, Coventry was an example of it really being used to its best. But there are lots of smaller stations that have. What's the name of the standard British rail construction? There was a thing. It was through the 70s and 80s. I can't remember.
Yeah, it was, wasn't it?
The architecture people are going to be shouting at me through the screen. Anyway, I quite like this. I mean, I'm sure there are things people can pick holes in, but I quite like timber in construction. I think it can be. It often ends up being used alongside a lot of plastic, so it can be a bit of greenwashing. But when used properly and sensibly, it can look quite good. I like the fact there's a clock. It's turning it into a civic space. I like the style of branding. I think it's good. It's good. It doesn't have to be rockets. It just has to be fine. Anyway, so I quite like that. What do you think, Kevin? Do you like it?
Yeah, it's better than well, it's interesting because it has a kind of continental feel to it. Although I can see the fences there, but yeah, it's better than the shipping container in a road that they put in Reading, right? Or
the shoebox for what they were putting in Birmingham. Yeah,
so it looks quite good, and it should be cheap to construct. I think that would be the If there's no, although at the same time, there's no kind of like substantial building, is there? So.
Yeah, people were saying, are they just going to get wet? I went through Wakefield. Yeah. I went through Wakefield Westgate the other day, and I'm conscious that the new, and it's the same in Derby. The canopy's so high that you just get soaked because the rain blows in. Mr. Tim Dunn, not sure who that is, but Mr. Tim Dunn says clasp. Of course, it's clasp. Thank you, Tim. Clasp is the name of the British Rail sort of modular-esque standard design catalogue to build station buildings. I don't think it was awful. I think clasp's all right. Yes, Simon Hawthorne, yes, CLASP, Consortium of Local Authorities Special Programme. Is that what that really means? Anyway, right, so enough of that. We're 13 minutes in and we haven't mentioned Pacers yet much. So, this, and the reason I put this in, because I don't normally just put in random Twitter nonsense, this is not a tram, this is just a bus. It looks like a tram, and it has some of the benefits of tram in terms of like how many people are in it, but for the most part, it doesn't have all the benefits that trams do. And we actually have a very good person to talk about such things with us tonight. Kevin, talk to us about the permanence of infrastructure and where the lines blur and what the benefits of trams over, what the perceived public perception benefits of trams, or even maybe things that look like trams are.
So the permanence thing is supposed to be. So it doesn't just have to apply to trams, but it's that idea that if you know where public transport is and it's visible. Then you're more likely to use it. So it's about trying to get kind of users that wouldn't necessarily automatically use public transport to get onto public transport. So mood will shift.
Yeah.
So a lot of the theory is that if it's visible, it's good information, that kind of thing, then it's easy to use. I mean, so probably the one good thing about this whole thing, and as usual, there's always that kind of huge burst of enthusiasm about these things, and then nothing much happens afterwards, right?
Yeah, it's because the technology, I mean, as a brief interlude, the technology behind this is a bit rubbish, and wherever it's been used before, they've ended up being ripped out because the technology is actually, and it's essentially a gadget ban to avoid better investment. But that doesn't mean that trammy-looking buses aren't a bad thing, as you say. Yeah.
I mean, it could be that. So actually, one good thing here might actually be that they paint where the bus goes on the road. Which would be a good idea, because, I mean, I've just moved house lately and I'm still trying to work out what the route of the local buses is.
Yeah.
So for example, that kind of thing might actually not be a bad idea.
And as you say, it's that permanence in terms of like unified branding, stations rather than just bus shelters, but actually, permanent infrastructure for level access onto the bus. These are all good things that trams bring and that these systems can bring. But this particular system, what happened was someone, a blue tick on Twitter, got very excited about this and then proceeded to get ratioed because they were like, look at this amazing tram. That's not a tram. There's no such thing as a trackless tram. Anyway, enough of this wittering. We're going to talk about Pacers. Hey, there we go. There's a Pacer getting his face smashed in. Basically, enough of all this wittering, enough of the news. We're 16 minutes into an episode about Pacers. It's high time we got cracking. So welcome to tonight's Rail Natter. the Intercity 225 fades away. Of course, there is a bouncy pacer in the intro video because they are part of the railway zeitgeist. They are part of people's mentality. There's a nice picture of a knackered Class 141 in Iran, unloved, and I think about to be scrapped. R.I.P. Yeah, these do occupy a sort of a strange space. Let's bring our faces together. Here we are. We're in the top corner. Hello, everyone. Pacers. I'm glad the pacer exists. Maybe it's strange to say that. It's a bit weird because I'd rather they were never introduced onto the railways. And as we're going to find out later, there was no benefit to them being introduced, and it was basically a big accident. And people getting ahead of themselves and thinking something was a good idea, and everyone sort of. And we'll discuss that shortly. But part of me is glad they exist because they capture so much of what is weird about railway culture. Particularly, I mean, as being British, I'm sure there's bizarre railway culture everywhere. But this feels like a particularly good representation of how bizarre British railway culture gets. In that these things are loved or hated to be loved or loved to be hated because they represent so many. I don't know. Yeah. So we're going to pick through
enigmatic. I think.
They are exactly. Yeah.
I dug out my Hornby pacer, for example.
Oh yeah, there it is. Wait a minute, I'm going to get you a larger face. Let's get you up next to me. Yeah, there it is.
The Hornby made, they made pacers, So there's so many other trains they could have made, but they must have thought there was a market for it, right? So
yeah, there definitely is. and here's a 141. I mean, nominally looking in better nick, but. I quite like this optimistic Metro Train branding it's got going on. This is hopelessly optimistic. What is Metro Train about this? Anyway, they've even stuck the lead sign in wrong. It's just, look at it. What a depressing sight.
The train's probably like 3 years old in the picture.
Yeah, I know.
I actually remember at the Weardale Railway when they ran 141s. They ran a 141 at least. And that was the whole Weardale Railway for a while.
Oh, yeah.
They wouldn't believe me when I told them that the plate that said 1984 was the time it was built, or 1982 or whatever. Yeah. They thought it was the midlife refurbishment.
Exactly. Some sort of ancient. And we're going to go through the history a bit, thanks to nicking a few slides out of the 158. Actually, it was nice. Went back to a very early episode of Rail Natter to nick some slides to bring us in. Anyway, so what we're discussing really here is this whole theme. So there are several big themes, but they're all basically asking the same sort of question. And we're going to start with this question and kind of explore it a little bit, which is the idea of the pacer as a pariah or as some sort of kind of collective pleasure. And so, I've heaped in some excerpts that you sent over, really, about pacers, and you can see pacers, being used as sort of. This is the one you always pick out, which I like, which is the pacer being used as a. This is a pacer here. Where's my thing? This here is a pacer. This is referring to TPE, which of course are famously never operated pacers. I quite like that. And so the pacer just gets cited as an example of like total railway decay, right?
Yes, but it's basically, and it became more than that. I think it became a political symbol of, in the late kind of 2010s, particularly of kind of the north of England getting left behind. So in terms of, levelling up agendas or whatever, it was adopted by the kind of New Statesman, kind of Guardian type media, if you like.
Yeah.
As a kind of a sort of an icon, a broader icon. I think the website City Metric might also have.
I think so.
Part of that sort of, so it kind of helped to push that sort of view of pacers as being something, kind of suboptimal, but not really thinking about why or.
Yeah, and it's true that they're often used generically without exploring some of the things we're going to explore now, which is a bit of a shame because it's. They could have done the same research you guys have done, and actually maybe explored it. But anyway, there we are.
That's the thing. Using publicly available files.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously, for journalists, using publicly available files would be difficult.
Because as we're going to identify, the story is they didn't need to exist. We didn't need to go through this suffering. They could have just got a load of extra 150s instead. Anyway, right. So, but as you say, we've got I've filched the same slide. So we've got a pacer cake here. We've got Vicky Pipe being very excited about the 144 there. This never happened. This did it happen? I don't know if this happened.
No, it didn't.
It was murdered. It was taken off the. It was taken away from the chance to happen thanks to coronavirus.
Basically, it was kind of inspired by the big tour that they did for the 125.
Yep.
And so Yeah, I think they basically wanted to do the same for Pacer. Go to, start in Whitby and end up in Blackpool, and then go back across to Cleethorpes and then go down to Wales. Something crazy like that,
Yeah. So which would have been fun. I'm sure it would have been a lot of fun. And actually, just because these are awful and should never have existed doesn't mean that there's not, we can't acknowledge people's positive, positive feelings about them. And a lot of it, I suppose, is wrapped into the kind of this element is wrapped into people's memories of their youth or memories of kind of past times and a feeling of what's doesn't exist anymore associated with these trains, or much as with HSTs still operating. These are trains that shouldn't be operating anymore, but actually there's rightly a huge okay, for the HSTs, rightly a huge fondness for them. For these, but like a huge fondness for these trains, and it's so it's the Pacer cake
from Below thing as well. So it's just because it's every day, it's not it's not worth commemorating.
It's this interesting thing about that. There aren't many southern commuter units in preservation, which is which is really strange, because those are some of those Mark 1 derived, horrendously dangerous and thankfully no longer in operation. But a lot of those Mark 1 derived EMUs are what the majority of rail travellers through quite a long period of time were lived on, for quite a few hours of the day. Anyway, interesting stuff. So. Kind of all, as I said, all these things come back to different questions. This is another frame of the question, which is: was the awfulness of the Pacer a worthy sacrifice? We haven't really talked about what's bad about the Pacer yet, have we? Maybe we should very briefly remind ourselves what is awful about the Pacer before we do this. Let's get our large faces up. Kevin, how many did you? I didn't used to travel on Pacers much when I was a little one, because I was in Scotland and we had lovely 158 Sprinters. And then
you were lucky at that.
I know,
in that sense, that's one of the things that always interested me, is how they never got to Scotland, knowing the Scottish network a bit. But the road quality isn't great. They had bus seats in originally, so they didn't even have proper railway seats. Although, to be fair, some of the older DMUs had bus seats too. People forget that. But they had bus seats in. They had they squashed 5 people across the way in. They're very noisy.
They don't have much soundproofing. They're kind of rattly things. They bounced around because of the design of their suspension. They screamed because of the design of their suspension, which we'll touch on very briefly while we go through the history of them.
This thing doesn't run very well, even in model form.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
Even on a well-built layout, they won't run well. They haven't
managed to miniaturize the single bogie axle, single axle bogie design. Anyway, right. So Pacers aren't great. They're clearly not a great train. And so, but often you hear people saying, well, we're going to look at this in a second, what people say about them. And the question really is, was the awfulness of the Pacer a worthy sacrifice? And so we've got 2 quotes here. And Ant Coles, Anthony, I'm so sorry that I'm using your quote, or that we're using your quote here. It's mean of us to use it. But unfortunately, it just captures a lot of the common stuff that gets said about Pacers very nicely in a single paragraph. So it's too easy to use the quote. So we've got Gervish at the top here, Terry Gervish, saying that the maintenance and modification costs of the... say again?
In his kind of mammoth...
Yeah, I was going to say, you're holding it up, crikey. In one of the mammoth tomes. The maintenance and modification costs... Yeah,
this is the one time he mentions Pacers, but anyway.
Oh, really? Is that it? Go on, give it a wiggle again. Terry, we're wiggling your book around.
Hi, Terry, if you're watching, but this is the one time
I don't actually have a copy of Gervish myself. To my discredit, I've got Bradley's history. I need to get Gervish's. Anyway, right. So, I digress, as often happens. Anyone new to Rail Natter, I can only apologise, but this is a theme of the series. So, Terry Gervish, the modification and maintenance costs of the first and second builds exceeded forecast levels by 30 and 45% respectively. The whole life cost of the new trains was scarcely lower than that of the first generation DMUs they replaced. That's Terry Gervish in his 2002 book. Contrast that with the general feeling, which is summarised neatly by Anthony. This was out of Rail Magazine, actually. The proposals were to cut railway lines, and obviously people didn't really want that. I think it's fair to say that for a number of rural routes, certainly in the southwest of England, the Pacer was almost a saviour because it reduced costs so much. Low running costs, low maintenance costs. the fact that the Pacers have been going up for over 30 years is testimony to that, although they are much maligned by many. So Anthony there, really summarising basically the myths around it, and repeating them in a way that's very neat for us. So sorry, Anthony, I'm not doing you a service here, but you may well have changed your mind. You also probably were being quite political with that answer, given it might well have been accompanying some sort of Pacer loving type article. I don't know. Anyway, so those two quotes really summarise that kind of opposing the evidence on one side, and everyone, not just everyone, kind of a large number of people's gut feelings about the vehicles, right? So, Kevin, I'm going to hammer through a potted history. Shout at me or interject if I say something wrong, or if you want to generally just add something in. So we're going to go back to, so in the olden days when everything was in black and white, there were rail buses. These were not the Pacer was not the first rail bus by a long measure. Actually, I should have put I've absolutely missed a trick in not putting in an image of wait a minute. I've missed a trick by not putting in an image of the shower bank that used to run over the Connell Bridge. I have an image, a nice high-res image of that shower bank, which I can't find quickly, and so can't put into the slide deck seamlessly and pretend that everything was cleverly set up and that I know what I'm doing. But anyway, so the rail bus has existed in some form or another for a very long time. Here's an example of one. I think this is the Park Royal or the Royal Park rail bus? I don't know much about these. They look funky as hell.
Helensburgh.
Yeah, I know, right? Craig and Doran, which is on that side of the country, up that corner. Anyway, yeah, so they've existed for a while, and indeed they used to run on the railway near me, on the Derwent Valley Light Railway. They used to run as an attempt to kind of glean ridership on that line, doomed unfortunately. Anyway, right, so waffle on, so rail buses.
Most countries have rail buses.
Yeah. It's a standard thing, right? It's not unheard. Yeah. It was a thing. At the same time, we had lots and lots of diesel multiple units being introduced through the second half of the 20th century. Certainly, in the middle of the 20th century, you had lots of multiple units, diesel multiple units being introduced that basically look like this. I mean, they almost all look pretty much like this, right? Not much to discern between them. And actually, so there was quite a lot of development. Then the last of that generation of multiple units actually came out in 1963. It's this thing. I don't know what class this is actually. Anyone tell me about class?
Transpennine 120 or something like that.
120. Yeah, that's right. It's got very fancy curved windows, which is quite snazzy.
I'll probably get slaughtered in the chat now. I think it's one of the Transpennine units.
Yeah, I think you're right. And we're both now going to get slaughtered in the chat, but that's fine. So that's 1963, and then there was a giant. Then basically that was it in terms of diesel multiple unit development. There was a big pause after that. Meanwhile, there's this chap, Dr. Alan Wickens. Do you remember him from the APT episode? Dr. Alan Wickens is one of the most important railway engineers in history, only after Trevithick and the Stephensons. He is the number 4, if you like, if you include George and Robert, the number 4 most important railway engineer in history of all time. Sounds like a bold claim. Listen to my Gadget Ban episode where I explained that, the one on maglev. Anyway, his team were developing all sorts of snazzy stuff in terms of trying to get over some of the issues of increased speed, particularly related to kind of hunting, so that the movement of bogies through the track that results in wear. And they came up with test vehicles. One of them is here, HSF V1. This is currently up in Shildon. I think it will be moving down to... maybe I don't know where it's going to end up. It's probably going to end up. Hopefully, it's going to end up as part of the bigger railway story, so it might well find its way down to York. Anyway, this thing is an incredible. It looks not very interesting or important. It is actually an incredibly important rail vehicle, and almost all modern railway vehicles owe a legacy, owe a heritage to this funny-looking freight wagon, which was capable of running at very high speeds. It says 90 on there, but they ran. There is a family of these, and some of them they ran up to ridiculous speeds. So this thing, as you can see, it has. If I squiggle on it, you can see here it has. I didn't really want to do that. It's got one axle per. Well, it's not really a bogie. They're kind of bogeyed. You can see they're designed to just have a single axle. So what I mean by that, it's just got 2 axles per vehicle. And And that's a bit weird because you'd expect that to not ride very well at high speeds. But this was really a test to test a load of features, including these sorts of these things here, and some of the kind of features of essentially they're called yaw dampers. So out of this came the yaw damper, which we know about recently because some of them fell off a load of CAF units, which have replaced pacers, ironically. So there's all the history gets complicated. But anyway, there's HSFV1. And
the thing is that a freight load doesn't tend to complain about the ride quality.
Can confirm. I mean, these were testing kind of stuff that was then eventually going to go. So that was 1964. These were then. Oh, I'll get to that bus in a minute. These were actually as part of the development for a new high-speed rail vehicle, which we all know ended up being the advanced passenger train. But actually, the developments of this went into the bogies for the HST and into other vehicles as well. Those yaw dampers. So that's 1964. So you see, we had the last DMU. Then 1964, we had HSFE1. Fine. Then we have the Leyland National Bus. Tell us about the Leyland National Bus, Kevin.
Yeah, so I mean, so this is kind of quite interesting in itself because this is for kind of British Leyland, if you like, enters, and this is a firm that's kind of, it's beloved by kind of business historians as an example of a kind of classic British basket case firm. In itself, that everything was going wrong in British Leyland. So if you look at its kind of car manufacturing side, it was never as competitive as Ford.
Horribly, yeah.
Didn't have a clear strategy. They were always on strike. And one of the things that's quite interesting was that the government. So there was the British Motor Company that owned Morris and Austin before that, and Rover as well, and a load of other brands. So the British way of doing business basically was to buy up. For kind of competing companies to merge together and hope that just somehow the company being bigger without actually merging the company together would make it more competitive somehow. So what the government then did in 1969 was forced Leyland, which was the bus manufacturer and lorry manufacturer. And it was actually quite a successful firm. And it basically forced Leyland, and I think Bristol as well, to merge together. So it forced Bristol and Leyland to merge, and then it forced Leyland to merge with the British Motor Corporation to form British Leyland. So this, and then after this, actually, in 1974, the company was nationalised when it was again virtually going bankrupt. So this is this bus is a kind of a triumph of this kind of era, late 60s, early 70s corporatism, really.
Yep.
So this is a period when kind of buses out of London and out of big cities were themselves nationalised into the National Bus Company. And this bus was the kind of project to create a kind of standard bus for the National Bus Company.
Yeah, and they made loads they spewed loads of them out, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So anybody that grew up in Britain, 70s, 80s, has seen these buses or travelled on these buses. These are kind of ubiquitous. There were more than 7,000 built. They're designed to be simple, easily replaceable. But the reason that they were attractive for the Pacer project, apart from anything else, is that the body shell was also designed to roll over in a crash. So it was thought to be more railworthy than other types of bus.
Okay, yeah.
That could have been used as well, like the Bristol series, for example. So yeah.
Okay. So then going from buses back to and we might talk a bit more about buses later, and a bit more about the potential idea that the Pacer was a continuation of this line for Leyland, and we'll talk about some of that stuff later. But back to the railway, where on earth then did the idea of this, like, where did they go from the National Bus to deciding that this, frankly, very futuristic looking vehicle? What's the story there?
Well, it kind of comes from, so this is the thing, it starts in the research department at British Rail, which was very active in the 70s, really, and there's kind of an interest in basically bringing a bus onto the railway. And so they work very closely, or quite closely, relatively closely, with Leyland to do this. And Leyland then think, oh, we've got a new business here. And the irony is that by the time that this is starting to happen, the Leyland National project itself is kind of being wound down.
Yeah.
This is one of the ironies, right? So the time that the production paces are built was actually when they stopped producing new Leyland Nationals. But Leyland thought that, so they wanted to go a lot further. Okay, they wanted to have, as we see here, kind of long trains that could be used in London.
Yep.
And Birmingham, so...
And so I think, so my perception of what happened here is that we had a situation where, you had the BR research team. Someone else interestingly asked the question, did the Pacer introduce the yaw damper to passenger use? No. The yaw damper was introduced much, much earlier than that with rail vehicle. The HST has yaw dampers well in advance of the Pacer. But it's a relevant question because essentially the research had gone, well, we've got these high-speed freight vehicles and there's and the national bus, and there's a combination there. And it was sort of started out as a bit of a, well, what could we do with it? Without really thinking about the wider policy implications, the wider potential rollout. It was more, well, we have a budget to do research for the sake of research, which is a good thing, by the way, and the railway fundamentally lacks this these days. The industry side research just for the sake of it. They went, well, just let's see what we can do with this thing. We've got a lightweight freight vehicle that can go fast. It's lighter because it doesn't have twin axle bogies. So let's shove the national bus body on it, see what we get. And it looks to me like Leyland, with this branding, went, with some way down the line on this process, went, we've got something here. We can monetize this. This is good. So, Sorry, go on.
This is the thing, is that there's a hoop, as with all these kind of big transport projects, or kind of novel kind of new sort of, but yet unique vehicles are kind of built, if you like. There's always this hoop that exports will follow.
Yep.
Right, and Brel also got excited by it for the same reason when it got to the kind of production stage.
There was a general interest, and it kind of comes down, and I know you talk a bit about, and I'm going to hop onto the next image because it looks super. This is what they were supposed to look like inside, super futuristic, and the idea, and I suppose this is where the kind of the technology. Talk about sublimity. Talk about the sublime. Tell us about that as a kind of a line of thought.
Yeah, so the sublime's idea basically comes from the work of Ben Fluberg, who looks at kind of big engineering and these kinds of projects, and he argues that basically one of the reasons that policymakers go for big projects really is that they have, they have a kind of a shininess to them, essentially. So you have a kind of an aesthetic sublime that, you're going to build a project because it looks good, right? Yeah. So it looks futuristic, it looks modern. So a good example of this is, any football World Cup now, it has to come with new shiny stadiums, and that's because you have that kind of aesthetic sublime. You build a stadium in St. Petersburg that looks like a spaceship. Well, this is the same kind of thinking here, right? We have this is going to somehow look quite cool and modern. So I know that a Leyland National looks a bit naff nowadays, but at that time it looked, compared to the kind of buses that had gone before, right? If kind of, think of AEC Regals, or the Routemaster might be one that people are more familiar with, right? But you think of that kind of era of bus.
Yeah, they were kind of pushing the envelope a bit in terms of styling, in terms of industrial design. And it's also part, I suppose, at this stage in the process where Leyland are getting very excited about it, and Brel actually, they're getting excited about it as it's sort of transitioning probably out of the control of the BR research team now. It's starting to get picked up by others and thinking, we can, this can be a thing. The challenge is just like we've talked about in previous Railnatra episodes about Hyperloop and why kind of gadget bands find their way into reality or don't. But the ease of which people push those things is because it's very easy to make something look futuristic and problem free in renders or artist impressions. And so I think if we skip to the next image, this is starting to look more like the reality, but it still looks kind of funky, right? It's still looking interesting.
It's different, it looks kind of strange at the same time, right? But that's the thing, is it's kind of blue sky thinking as well. And the sort of first prototype Lev 1 that they built, it looks a bit like this.
Yeah.
It looks a bit more rubbish than this, to be honest.
I was going to say, this is and this is why I put this slide in here, because I can quite happily jump from the artist's impression to the reality, which is obviously somewhat less glamorous. I think this is Lev 1. It might be left. There were a couple of these they found their way around. For a while, Lev 1 was on the Wensleydale. Actually, it might still be on the Wensleydale. I don't know if it's moved. It's quite a vibe. And this was still basically in prototype mode. Clearly, the fact that it's got the Leyland branding on it quite prominently, you can see here, Leyland are already rubbing their hands together. But from a British Rail perspective, my understanding of looking through the documentation you've got and sort of reading between the lines of the history is that probably at this point, certainly the technical people within British Rail were still not thinking about this as being a long-term practical solution. This was still a, see how far we can go with this. So I think this thing started running faster than they could keep up. And then it probably found its, at this point where it was becoming it was lines that were being submitted to the Treasury, at which point probably people further up in British Rail were having to justify those line items to the Treasury in some form. And then the Treasury are probably asking questions like, well, what's this going to be for? And that's probably where it started going places it probably ought not to have. So, Lev 1.
So about kind of 1978, 79, the kind of the passenger department starts to get interested in it and its possibilities then. And that's when you start to get this huge kind of interest in, okay, let's spend. So they build this prototype, and actually at first they're actually it's not even powered. The first.
Oh, really? Okay.
Build a Lev 1, and then they power it to see how that works. Okay, it vibrates quite a lot. It's got a lot of problems, but they keep going with this, and then the passenger department the passenger department's got that problem that all those old DMUs, so a lot of them were built after the modernisation plan. They're now, the mean age of the fleet is about 20 years. There's also the problem of asbestos starting to appear as well. So there's this whole kind of climate of the kind of sort of thinking already, and a lot of the trains built under the modernisation plan, they were in short production runs. They weren't very good themselves, right? So they're starting to think, well, okay, we need to replace these trains.
And this is
somehow at some point, and they kind of grab onto this.
And this is where the nebulousness of you cannot pull the technological away from the political. You cannot pull those two apart. And so, as we said, the last DMU that was built was 63, and there'd essentially been no attention to their replacement, particularly since that point. So suddenly there was the realization, oh, actually we've got quite a large fleet that was built in quite a short space. Like a large number of vehicles are going to need replacing in quite a short space of time.
Yep.
And as you say, all of a sudden this is appearing and going past people's eyes, and then the people go, well, what is? Okay, right. Well, that becomes a thing, and so we reached 1980. So we've already said, you said 79, they'd already realised that they needed a new multiple unit. So we reached 1980. There's the APT not doing particularly well at this point. So we've got this was trialling the same technology that that Pacers were eventually going to run around with. Well, the Pacer unit, the Lev 1 had already been whizzing around on similar technology to the sort of the stuff that enabled us to have these lovely bogies and so on and so forth.
It was a case that the APT had gone off in a different direction. From what I can work out, the sort of tree of the high-speed freight wagon had gone off in a different way in the later 70s.
Yeah, so there were a fleet of different HSF V1s, and they fed into the yaw damper research, which is what led us to APT. But they'd continued with that development because they were still looking at other potential, faster freight. They were trying to deal with yaw, hunting problems with freight as well. So the HSFE1 was continuing to be used in research after APT had already started becoming its own thing. So in terms of our own, back to the Pacers, well, the Lev 1 had become a bit more of a practical train-looking thing, and then here we have this is the Class 140, or kind of sketches of what it would become. And it's interesting, they were referring to it not as the rail bus, but as the lightweight diesel multiple unit. This was, and I think you'll touch on this again, this was felt to be just the future of the DMU.
Yeah, so
by a lot of people.
I love this. I just love this image because it kind of creates a sense of kind of like metamorphosis, or like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly or something like that. So. Even though basically that 140 is basically just two buses stuck end to end, but what happens here is that they kind of, there's some discussion about, well, okay, we need a vehicle that can fit about 100 people, but we very rarely run single car units on British Rail, really. So the only other single car unit was the Class 121, Again, I'll probably get slaughtered at that time. Probably get slaughtered in the chat for that, but still. But they didn't. There wasn't much. So the thing was is that apart from the Stourbridge branch line or whatever, there's kind of the Cardiff Docks branch line. They kind of say, well, we need one that can. We need a unit it's cheap to operate, but it can withstand occasional.
It needs to be able to deal with a little surge every now and then, which a single car can't. Yeah.
So a double car was needed, and that was kind of okay. So that was when they sort of developed the Class 140.
Yeah. Which you can see here in the depot there, looking quite shiny. I should have put the picture of it at Keith and Dufton looking knackered. But anyway, actually they've painted up half of it, so it's not looking quite so knackered anymore. There's the 140.
And this is kind of sent, it's kind of sent around the country really. It's sent to Leeds because the West Yorkshire PTE are already very keen on it. It's it's sent to Scotland for a bit. It's sent to Wales for a bit. It's sent around. I think it's sent to East Suffolk line for a little bit as well. It's kind of sent around the country to promote it essentially. But even before this prototype is finished, they're already starting to talk about putting it into production.
Yeah, so this is the worrying bit, right? The momentum behind it is getting ahead of its actual practicality and feasibility as a unit. Right, brief interjection, and I'm noticing people talk about the 210 already. So there was some work and research through the late 70s, and it kind of culminated in, because there were lots of multiple units appearing through that period. So there were body shells and things popping up, and one such was the Class 210, which made use of essentially a multiple unit body shell, strengthened at one end, and with a big diesel motor at this end. So if I press my boutons here, you can see this end, and we've talked about this in the 158 episode. As you know, this was all diesel engine, which obviously is not great for either mass distribution or passenger capacity, because you've sacrificed a load of seats there to fit your engine in. But anyway, there's the Class 210, and it, well, that wasn't a particular success either, frankly, but for different reasons. I mean, for those reasons, it was a bit heavy. But the 210, the reason I put this in is because the 210 appears in some of the data that we'll bring up later. So, figures it's worth us remembering that in 1981 the 210 is appearing. So
it's going to be a two-pronged strategy.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm just going to hide our faces briefly because we're covering up the top management brief thing. But there we are. So these two letters here. Tell us about these. So this is with testing ongoing. And actually, I think I have a video of the ongoing testing that I'm going to fling up in a second. But kind of tell us how this is going.
So this is actually when the prototype tours the country in the middle of 1981, and this is probably where the myth about Pacer starts to appear, really, because what you've got on the left is a public relations release that is meant to go to the newspapers. What you've got on the right is a management briefing that went around inside British Rail. And they're almost identical, very similar in wording. And basically both of them are sort of saying, okay, so the 210 is mentioned there, but basically both of them are saying, we're bringing in this rail bus. It's fantastic, it does a top speed of 75 mph. Its weight is 30% less than a conventional two-car train, and it's a significant saving in operations and fuel consumption. So don't forget the context here. This is just after the second oil crisis, after the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s, so 78, 79. So oil, I think, and the price of oil took on a bigger significance then than it does now as well. So a lot of this is kind of they're very concerned about, okay, if we get a lighter train, then, it'll cost as much as a bus to run, essentially. It'll be much cheaper to run.
And they're already, they're talking about the strategy for replacement. Here you can sort of see they're talking about, so this is in the management, this is talking about, it would be uneconomic to use Class 210s as a general replacement for all existing DMUs. At this point, the 210 is seen as the longer term DMU, kind of the more intense DMU service. So it's it's interesting. And so this video that I'm about to play, hopefully with reasonably audible, actually, let me just check that. Hopefully with the sound being reasonably audible. Kevin, you won't hear it, I'm afraid. But this video hopefully is going to be useful because I think that it's really interesting what the BR person says at the end, the BR manager at the end, clearly mentally reading from a script. And I think the line that they give is really interesting. So we'll listen to that next.
To be developed by British Rail's Research and Development Division. It's been built in collaboration with Leyland bus manufacturers, and BR is pleased with the results because operating costs have been cut while standards of passenger comfort remain high. After today's demonstration, the train will go into service on the Springburn-Cumbernauld and Glasgow East Kilbride Bar Head routes, which have had closure threats hanging over them.
I just pause it there. So that's just the bit. You might you've watched this video, I know, Kevin, because I think you told me to watch it in the first place. That's where they've just said all the places that the Pacer will run in and around Glasgow, which I always laugh at because they trialled it and Glasgow said no. It never came back north of the border until it arrived in the Keith and Dufton Railway. Anyway, sorry, I shall continue. The important quote is still coming up. Kevin, this is just silence for you. I'm so sorry.
So might Railbus throw such routes a lifeline in time to come?
Well, of course, in Scotland we've got a lot of rural lines and we're seeking ways of economising in the way we operate them. And I think this train, it's lightweight construction. It's about 30% lighter than our normal DMU sets. I think it could be used to great effect in Scotland. But the purpose of today's exercise and the other ones you've mentioned is to get passenger reaction to how they operate, whether they like them. And we're really waiting to reflect the views of the passengers, because at the end of the day, they're the ones that count.
Through market research, it'll now be up to passengers to say what they think of Railbus. Incidentally, BR's critics can relax. Railbuses run today went strictly to time.
Oh, there we are. The classic to time pun at the end. Right, let's bring our little faces back in the top corner. So that's Kevin. You didn't hear any of that, but I think you remember what he said, and you can see his face. You saw his face while he's delivering it, and he's talking about we're looking at ways to economise and using the phrase rural railway lines. All these familiar buzzwords, and as you say, those two letters that you put up previously start showing that there is essentially a confected message being created around these units already.
Yeah, that's the party line. Is that even though they're trailing them in urban areas.
So right, data. We have some data that we've put up. So we're slightly covering it, but at this end you can see there's the. Let me just do this. There we are. I've got to just make sure I'm flicking between text and anyway. This here, Kevin's face is hovering, but this is 101. So this is referring to the kind of the existing existing diesel multiple unit as a comparison. So here you can see the comparator is this is the lightweight DMU, this is the Pacer, and then it's comparing between the kind of the 210, which is still at this point. I think these data sets are coming in around the time of the discussion being that the choice really is between the strategy is the lightweight DMU versus the Class 210. So tell us what we're looking at here.
Yeah, so it's basically that's the idea, is that there's going to be the lightweight DMU and the Class 210. But what they're trying to say here or show here is that this is energy consumption in kilowatt hours. And basically the lightweight, so this is based on test runs, at least I think it is. Right, and it's showing that the lightweight DMU basically has superior energy consumption on all of these very different routes, perhaps. So Shrewsbury Aberystwyth, quite a long route. You probably wouldn't have used it there. It probably doesn't shave that much compared to the 101 there, but it does dramatically the 210.
Yeah, dramatically better than the 210 and marginally better than the 101. You can see that it's a marginal improvement in energy efficiency against the 101. The 101 being pretty lightly built as a unit, it's interesting to compare, but obviously drastically better. Certainly for that longer route, drastically better than the 210. But actually, the 210 was not good for energy consumption, so it's an interesting and not particularly useful comparison, actually. But anyway, so this is the idea.
Locomotive inside a DMU.
So this is the interesting question about energy consumption compared to modern units. I don't know, actually. I should have looked that up, probably. Do some Googling, everyone. I'm sure in the chat, this is what the RailNatter chat's all about. I'm sure someone will go and Google that. Anyway, right, so the next slide is about running times. And it's the same trialed routes that kind of we just looked at there. And you can see that we've got, Shrewsbury Aberystwyth is kind of, so we've got 81 miles, quite a number of intermediate stops, 60 mile an hour line speed. They've improved that since then. And the Pacer does it in, I presume this is in minutes, 213. The 210 is kind of about the same, 209, 216, and then the 101 is quite a lot slower. So all this data, which to me, this is data they've got on trials. You can see the early data, presumably using the 140, is looking favourable, right?
Yeah. So remember, speed's not. So that's the thing, is that it's not. We're not kind of talking about journey shrinking here as such necessarily, but it's kind of evidencing that it's good enough to compete at this time. Although part of the thing that does become important later actually is the ability to run, shorter, kind of faster journeys that have faster acceleration.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily the top speed of the train, but it's the acceleration of the train when you're on a short distance line, of course.
Yeah.
So to some extent, they're kind of trying to show that, but they're also trying to show it's comparable to the 210, which I think is quite interesting.
Yeah.
As well. So what they're trying to do here is that they're using the evidence from these test runs, really, to try and construct a case for building the lightweight DMU for commissioning it.
And as ever, constantly the comparison is between the Pacer and the 210. The 210 is continually being placed as the comparator vehicle, despite the fact that probably at the point that interview is happening, certainly, the 210 was already being written off as not the future, which is really interesting. So then I think this letter is interesting because it starts showing that there's trouble at mill. Everything is not quite all rosy with this marvelous prototype lightweight DMU thing. And I think, there's probably more. In fact, I think you've got some more data that you can let us know kind of behind the scenes as well in relation to this. But I think it's interesting to, this is... The agreed program was designed as quickly to establish as quickly as possible the causes of failure, leading to corrective action and arrangements. Yeah, so you can see, if the word failure is appearing, then clearly this is not all happening without hiccup.
Yeah, so basically Leyland were insistent. So their subsidiary was a company called Self-Changing Gears, and this is kind of old-fashioned capitalism in which you buy as much from within the company as possible. So it's kind of the 80s when you get this kind of big unbundling, and firms are sort of told, only do what you're good at by consultants. So by this time, Leyland are insistent that their gears are the best, right? And now and there is some so there's some evidence that the gears actually on the transmission on the Leyland National weren't very good, but But what we see here is quite interesting is that basically at every stage of this process, they say, we've identified that the gearboxes are a problem, the transmission's a problem. It doesn't support the train's acceleration very well. We get gearbox failure. I think part of the problem was for a lot of the components was that they were transferring road to rail, and so different forces were acting on the train. Essentially, so when a real vehicle goes, into a corner, it keeps going into the corner in a different way to which. Now you're better qualified in this area than me, Gav, so stop me if I'm talking nonsense.
No.
But basically, this is the thing: is that the forces that act on the train are very different, and so a lot of the kind of automotive components which weren't of the highest quality in the first place, then turn out mysteriously not to be particularly resilient in a train, which is going to then travel from, Aberystwyth to Birmingham.
Yeah, these long distances. And already there was feedback coming from engineers who are looking. So this being spearheaded by the passenger kind of sector within BR, the passenger group within BR, but the engineering function, the chief mechanical engineer, as it probably still was at that point, their team started looking at this and getting, because it had kind of largely happened without much input from the regular BR engineering teams, and so they started getting hold of this and looking at it, and they weren't just moaning because it's not their train. They were pointing out serious flaws in the way that this thing was built. They're saying, this thing is going to rattle itself to pieces. It is just not designed to cope with the kind of the fact that the bus travels on pneumatic tires and bounces around. That means that it's not very energy efficient, but it means that it doesn't have to be quite as resiliently built. Whereas a rail vehicle, because it's much more rigid, you've got that load transfer through steel on steel, everything has to be kind of more resilient, but as a result of that, it's much more energy efficient. This was the worst combination of both, in that it was lightweight, not very resilient, but running on steel on steel. And so there were already complaints from the engineers, I think. I think you picked up on some of these things.
Yeah, so they talk about vibration, they talk about torsional stress, which is basically where beams start to twist because of the stress that they're being put under. So there's all of these kinds of problems. But even things like the seat trims, the driver's desk, the controls, so there are lots of problems with the driver's desks and the control systems. The multiple unit control system, there's a problem with track circuits in that when the train runs on lesser used tracks, right, rural railways, right? Right, so you run to Whitby, 4 times a day. When it runs on lesser used tracks, the track circuit technology might not work as well. So it's fine when it's in busy stations, it's fine at Waterloo, but it's not. It's not fine at on the branch to Whitby or wherever.
On lesser used branch lines, which allegedly are supposed to be its destination. Yeah.
So all of these kinds of problems, and I mean, another great thing is that they say, the life of a bus is 15 years, but that's shortened by road salt. Right, so
yeah.
So the argument is, road salt gets into the bus's engine and corrodes the bus. It won't happen on the railway, so that'll be all right, So there's a lot of thinking like this. And I think it's driven by the fact that it's BR are keen, the passenger department are keen, so people on the top board of BR are keen about this.
Yeah, and they're just thinking, that's just teething. The engineers are always complaining. They're just teething problems. We've had whatever. This thing is fine. We've got all the numbers. It runs. It's great. And actually, so anyway, keep conscious of time. We've already busted the hour. I hope you're all right, Kevin. You don't mind sticking on until we finish, do you? You don't mind?
Yeah.
Sorry to everyone who wants to go and have dinner, but it won't be. We're not going to be too long. Don't worry. Anyway, 1984. This thing arrives in 1984. So bearing in mind, we haven't got a pacer running in full service yet. 3 years after it was being trialled, or 4 years after it's been trialled, still haven't got it in service yet. Clearly some issues. Meanwhile, this little pipsqueak appears. The Class 150, actually looking very shiny here. I think this is it. In fact, this is definitely in trial because it's one of Dave Coxon's photos, and he used to do train testing. So here's a nice picture. Thanks, Dave, for the photo. Nice picture of a 150. This thing appears. And it doesn't have the problems of the 210 because it has distributed power. It's pretty lightweight, actually, and it's got bogies. So and it's also built as a rail vehicle. So it's solving all the problems that it's not as rubbish as the 210, and it's not as rubbish as the Pacer. So I know lots of people don't like the 150, and lots of people don't like sprinters, but this is satisfying all of the problems that both the 210 and the Pacer had. Anyway, so. Meanwhile, so that was 1984, and all of a sudden we do get an operational Pacer. The 141 appears. Hooray! Boo! And here, I love that they've both got special written in there. I like that. Anyway, yeah, they're both special trains. Absolutely. So here is a horribly knackered-looking 141. This might be at Weardale, actually. Maybe
it looks too big for Weardale. I think.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. It's on a heritage line anyway. It's on one of the maybe it could be Keighley and Worth Valley. I don't know. Anyway, I think it's in one of the northern heritage railways. Here it is. Here is the 141. It gets running. It happens. So you'd think hooray, but actually they're probably not that well received. Anyway, we're going to skip forward. So these things are not that well received, frankly. Lots of problems. In fact, I think you've got some issues that you've got on a slide about these when they entered service.
So basically the same problems persist. So even though we saw before that they're saying, we're going to iron out these transmission problems, the transmission problems remain, and there's still problems with braking, transmission, the track circuit problems still there. The long wheelbase means that they squeal on curves. And there's kind of rough riding over joined track, and again, rural railways or less modernised railways in the north of England or in the West Country, they're not continuous welded rail yet.
Yep.
So again, you don't have that same. So all of these things, actually, it turns out that a cheap train doesn't go well with a cheap railway.
Yeah.
Right, so
the Americans had already worked this out. We've not learned lessons from our American friends who knew that if you have a knackered rubbish railway, you actually need good trains and good locomotives and rolling stock.
Well, the other thing that's kind of significant here as well is actually the pictures in West Yorkshire livery.
Yes.
And, and it was actually so what happened was that it appears that they're so desperate for the production run that BR, they promised that West Yorkshire could reduce their Section 20 payments if they took on the 141s. But as soon as 141s came into service, they started to have really big operational problems. So, and at one point, the fleet availability is horrendous. So I know that, these problems are common in new trains, but this is a particularly bad case in that, at one point, so there was a fleet of 20, and at one point only 6 were available for service. I only vaguely remember seeing 141s in operation myself at York a couple of times, because they didn't really come up to the northeast, but yeah. But they looked weird, because they're also bus width.
Yeah, they were like, they did not use the whole of loading gauge. They were just the same width as the buses had been. So they hopeless big gaps to the platform. That's not really been improved with the Pacers. They've always been awful for accessibility. But just not just weird.
Well,
weird
the accessibility thing was also an issue because in the prototype, so the accessibility could have been planned in because the prototype was actually built with a low floor.
Ah, interesting.
But there was a problem with. It meant that the part above the door, I forget the name of it, was out of line with the rest of the body shell, and they didn't like this. So basically,
it could have been
lower the floor and have steps going in. So a kind of a little.
I'd have been a fan of the Pacer if it had a 915mm floor height. I'd have maybe hated them less. Crikey. Yeah, good grief. Yeah. It's interesting how these things go. We have a question, by the way. It's a good question. Remember to @ me in so I spot your question. But I need to scroll up because other people have been chatting since. Mr. Tim Dunn from London asks, something I haven't been able to resolve. When did the Pacer branding first appear? Was it the 141 or the 142?
Oh, good question. Well, I think it comes with the 142, but where it came from is actually still a mystery to me.
Ah, interesting. Okay.
So that's one thing I haven't been able to find out. I think it might have been to give it a name that wasn't Sprinter.
Yeah, I was going to say, was it as a result of the Sprinter branding appearing? Which did the Sprinter branding come with the 150? When did the Sprinter branding appear? Actually, was it with the 150 or was it actually late? No, it was. The Sprinter did appear with the 150. I'm sure of it.
I think so. Yeah, but I think these were names that were given to it by the provincial division, which only started. So it starts in '82, and it takes over. I think it basically takes over BR Passenger for non-London lines. So I think that these would be the names that come in after. So they kind of come in after sectorization, basically.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
But the Pacer is not a product of sectorization. It's a product of an earlier period, really.
Yeah. So the answer, Tim, is we don't know. We're not sure. I guess is around about the time the Sprinter branding appeared. But so the 150 and the 141 appeared in the same year, 84. Does that mean that Pacer was given that name? Yeah. When was? I suppose. Yeah. I'd have to have a look and see when provincial.
Yeah. Well, they were also launched as skippers originally in the West Country.
Ah. Okay. So there's already
sure. Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly when they first started to use that title, but they got that name quite quickly afterwards, actually. Yeah, certainly by the late 80s, early 90s, they were well known as Pacers.
Talking of which, so these having been resoundingly hated and getting shipped off to Iran, actually they were shipped off to Iran in the 90s, I think. But anyway, these were hated, or they weren't well received, I don't think. So they were followed up by more. So only a year later, actually. Wait a minute, this is 84. Actually, in 85, you got the 142. So it must have been a very short run of 141s, not a large run of trains, followed by the 142, which was basically looked the same, but actually expanded to. So the 142 expanded to fill out railway loading gauge, so it's a bit fatter and kind of looks a bit weird as a result, I think. And then even more derpy looking is the 143, which was built not by Leyland at all. I think this was built up in Glasgow by Alexander, yeah.
And Barclay. And Kilmarnock, I think.
Hunslet, Barclay and Alexander combined, right, to put this thing together. So that's the 143. So that's those two. So in 1985, we got the pacers that were, and indeed, unfortunately, still are, bashing around on the network.
But the important thing there is that they kind of say, if we just make it rail size, and if we reduce the amount of automotive components in, and put more rail original components in, it'll work. It'll be fine.
Two problems. Firstly, public image of these trains has already been embedded with the 141, so they're already fighting an uphill struggle, and fundamentally, this is fundamentally a train born out of a different design ethos, and so trying to reverse that to sprinterize it just ain't gonna work, and potentially it's gonna cause more expensive bodges. So anyway, there's the 142 and the 143. So data time. Oh, this is a fun thing, because this is an invoice for a pacer, right? This is an invoice for a class 142. Yeah. Unit 78.
Yeah, so basically this tells us that they paid £364,000 a unit. So, and the original, so you've got to kind of be careful, because so I noticed my old student Barry is here, who
regular viewer. Hey Barry Jones.
The importance of inflation, and in this period, so when they start talking about commissioning the 141, they're kind of looking at 250,000 a unit. So that I don't think that's unreasonable inflation, probably through the 80s, to get to 364,000. So I think that they were probably still relatively cheap to buy, but that's where the bargain stops. And I think the whole project cost them about 16 million or something like that. So it's okay. So they're relatively cheap to buy as trains go, right?
But capex isn't the whole picture, is it? This is the issue, which is interesting, as we're going to find out when we get to some of the really juicy numbers later on. What's really interesting is that the idea was that these were going to have very low maintenance costs, and indeed not just the idea, the perception today. We saw Anthony Coles' statement where he says where he talks about the perception is that these are low maintenance trains. Anyway, we shall get to that later. So here are some NPV graphs, right? Some net present value graphs, and you're going to have to talk us through these. Firstly, you have to say which one's which, because it's not clear. These are in the same order they were on your slide.
Yeah. So basically, what this is about is they're trying to project here how many trains they need to buy to do a certain mileage that the old DMUs would have done. So what's quite interesting here is that the one on the far left is replaced by lightweight. So lightweight is a pacer. Okay, so it's got a fairly, it's got a reasonable sleep. And yeah, it's true that basically to do 100,000 miles, and you can replace kind of 0.7 of a pacer roughly can replace one DMU. Basically, is a kind of point.
Okay, so it's I get it. Yeah, got it.
So what you can see then is, now often what's great in archives is it's the person that originally prepared the thing or was interpreting it that marks on it what they think. It's quite useful, because what you've then got further over are the break-even points for sprinters.
So
and the point is that where they put those circles in, they're kind of saying, well, what we find is that it only takes kind of one sprinter. It only needs to become over sort of 70,000 miles, or even 60,000 miles on the right, to replace one DMU, basically. So what one sprinter can do by the time you get to the graph on the right is replace one 3-car low density unit.
So this last one is sprinter. This is sprinter as well.
Yeah. So that's sprinter as well. So so the first and second graphs are quite comparable. I realise as well that part of the problem is the reproduction is not great, because it's Mike.
Is he taking a photo?
It's actually David. I think it was either me or David would have taken the photo of the original. So that's a photo from the original from the National Archives. So sorry about my Chris Whitty well-off graphs here that are not very good. But basically what they're trying to say is that the curve gets steeper with the sprinter. Right, the more that, so it's kind of comparable, and the pacer might have an advantage where you've got a kind of old-fashioned power car, trailer car unit. But when you start getting into kind of replacing higher density trains, the sprinter becomes more advantageous, and it's more. The other thing about the sprinter that becomes important, and you see this in a lot of the reports they write at the time, is that what they're starting to think about is replacing locomotive hauled trains with DMUs as well. And, they're well down on local haul in this period. Sorry, enthusiasts, but they are. And And this is part of the thing, because what they're interested in with this project as well is they want to have fewer trains overall. Okay, so that part of the projects that are going on is that, so the lightweight, it kind of starts with the lightweight idea. That's why the 210 dies, I think, probably. But then what the Sprinter's particularly good at is because it has the fast acceleration they want. It has the low running costs they want, but it's also more versatile. You can get a similar number of people into 3 or 2 cars of a Sprinter that you can to a local haul 6-carriage train.
Yeah. So this is what's saying here. So this last graph, as you say, the last graph here, the key point of this last graph, much steeper. So the point is that a 2-car Sprinter is replaced. A 2-car Sprinter has the same number of seats as a 3-car low-density old series multiple unit.
Yeah.
And so you're getting the return on that much. So within 100,000 miles, you're replacing kind of 1 for 1. The point, kind of 1 for 1 2-car Sprinter with a 3-car lower density multiple unit, and then you say that the local haul would be even steeper than this. You'd expect to see it kind of even, goodness knows what steepness, but you potentially get an even steeper line because these are quite, the Mark 1 coaches that invariably they're replacing are quite, or sometimes Mark 2s, quite low density and very expensive, and also operationally a pain in the backside. And also there's all the implications of requiring stabling and shunting and all these things that you don't need. Multiple unit local haul is hopeless for modern railway operation. TransPennine only did it through through the fact the supply chain said we can't give you the multiple units you need. And so that local haul is not actually great for operational. It's great for greisers. The fans love them, but from an operational perspective, they're a nightmare. Single point of failure, lots of issues. You've got to kind of move the consist into place. Lots of problems, right? So the Sprinter is satisfyingly replacing all of these types of trains and is better at it than a Pacer, which is what these graphs really show, isn't it? So
yeah, and the two become. So this is the thing as well, is that the Pacers don't. The two become almost kind of interchangeable operationally. So this idea that Pacers save rural railways, again, well, surely Sprinters must be in the frame too, because and that's the thing, is that the evidence then seems to show that actually Sprinters were cheaper to run over the long term than Pacers were.
Indeed, and we have receipts for that, by the way. Matt Reed, your question's a very good one. How much more expensive were the Sprinters' maintenance and cost compared to the Pacers? We're getting there. So this is the crux of it, right? Did Pacers save any rural railways? And this is where where you get to plant on the table all of your juiciest data, which I've lined up here in order of your conclusions, I think. So, firstly, we've got this line here, right? This little extract here. So tell us about this extract here and tell us what it's saying. It's in fact, I'll read it out for the benefit of the. I'm conscious there are listeners on this. I'm dreadful at this. Right. So this is quite a long paragraph. I'm going to do it though. It is true that much of our future diesel railcar build will be in the form of medium-weight bogie units. So already they're writing the Pacer off there. This is because our studies have shown that on many services, a combination of 1- and 2-car bogie units is in fact cheapest. In particular, where traffic exceeds the capacity of a twin-unit rail bus, it is cheaper to buy and operate a 2-car bogie unit than a 3-car rail bus. However, we do foresee a significant role for the rail buses, hence the current order for 75 2-car units and the likelihood of further such orders being placed. I always find this paragraph weird. It's like, Pacers aren't really worth their salt and Sprinters are better. However, we have ordered a load of Pacers. Hooray! I always find it a bit of a weird, two different paragraphs.
It's because it's strategically they're committed to Pacers, whether they like it or not. So this is the thing, is that they've already realised that they're not as versatile as Sprinters, but they're kind of already, so they bought this, so they bought that kind of tranche of 142s and then 143s, and then they're already kind of again looking, even in 85, at authorisation of 86, even I think, at authorisation to try and build more of them as well. So they're still thinking about it, even though they're kind of saying here. So what the context of this is that this was in response. Sometimes in archives, what's unfortunate is you don't get you only get one side of the conversation. But this is a copy letter of a response apparently sent to Portuguese railways about an inquiry into Pacer rail buses.
Really?
And their effectiveness. And in this, they kind of list lots of the problems with the transmission and the wheel squeal and the track circuits and all these kinds of things. And then they say, well, okay, but they have been okay in some ways, And that's the interesting thing. And so they're still, And part of the problem is that because of the investment horizon, the delivery times, and the fact that it took, they order from September 81, I think the 141s were authorised, and it took until 83 for them to be delivered, for example. So you've got these long lead times, you've got these long lead times on trains. That means that you kind of got, you've got a strategy where it takes time to follow through. So they still have to say, we're committed to them.
Yeah. And what's interesting, of course, is at this time, all the sprinters are starting to appear and are seen more popular. It's realised that they are far more successful. Not just the numbers side, but they're received better by passengers. And so the 150 is, let's face it, quite a rudimentary vehicle. It's better than a Pacer, frankly, but it's possibly not quite as obviously better. But by the time you get into the 156, which is a very competent unit, suddenly the number, you're starting to see these the success and the kind of the positive feeling from the public of these sprinters is clearly a problem. The Pacer is clearly being realised as a problem. As Sakura has said, the second half of this is really basically saying, however, we have ordered them and now need to explain why we made that mistake. Yes. Yeah. So this slide is possibly the most fun slide in this whole presentation, right?
Yeah.
So this is the crux of it.
So this comes in a more financial report, but this is about 1987 when they're looking at ordering 86, 87 when they're looking at future kind of orders. And this ends up being orders for things like the 158 and trains going in that direction. But what they show here is basically that 150s appear to be cheaper to operate. So this is maintenance.
So I can shove it. I can emulate, because this is very difficult to read because of a mixture of either yourself or Dr. David Turner's terrible photo work.
It's kind of a photocopy of a photocopy.
But also there's a lot. I was going to say there's a lot of printer burn there as well, a copier burn. So the Class 108 cost per annum for maintenance, the total annual outgoing to run this unit, 521,000 a year. Right. This is about. You say this is around in 87 numbers. You reckon?
Yeah, so this is roughly 87 numbers, and remember that's kind of a life expired unit as well.
Yes, yeah. So that's a really old unit. So that's a lot of money because the thing is falling to bits. So the newer units, Class 142, annual cost for maintenance around 250,000, 255,000 actually per annum.
Yeah.
Now the 150 is 234,000 per annum. So it's beating the Pacer by 20,000 a year. That's quite a substantial betterment.
And it's adding up. And the thing I really like is at the bottom it talks about the summary of savings over existing units. And one of the things that really fascinates me there is that it appears to claim that a 142 only saves one staff member, whereas a 150 saves 19.
Oh, I didn't pick these out. So these are down here. Let me scribble on these to show people what I'm talking about. So this is summary of where's my thing gone? Here. Summary. So this is saying summary of savings over existing units. So this is talking about hours. So this is talking about hours.
That's standard hours, and then it kind of shows these
are about comparable. So they're about comparable. But this is the key. Staff. This is incredible. Staff saving, as you say, staff saving 1. Compared to staff saving of 19.
I don't know if I completely believe that.
Is it because of increased maintenance requirements, and so that they are just taking that much extra depot staff to? I mean, that seems quite a radical difference. But there we go. But
what is certainly a factor here is that so you see in some of the documents that they're talking about if we replace it. One of the things about replacing trains is that they wanted to close depots.
Yeah.
Okay, so they thought that if they had more reliable trains and fewer trains, they needed fewer trains to operate the same service, or even more frequent services, actually. So this is one of the other ways I think it's kind of, this is the Bob Reed era now, They're sort of thinking, we can run more frequent services as well with fewer trains. What
Sweating the asset more.
Really close down depots. So, because most of the depots that were around were not actually the ones that the train spotters liked. A lot of them were kind of DMU depots, right? And there's York, Lincoln, Doncaster, Newcastle. So there's a whole list of them listed. So York was definitely closed, for example, out of it. Lincoln, I think, was probably closed. I'm not sure, but so there's a whole list of depots that
these can do more. Per diagram, the newer units can do more than the old multiple units. And so we're getting closer to the model of operation we have now, where we really sweat the hell out of track and train. So that's a fantastic slide. That's one of the best slides in here in terms of data. Is the obvious? Nope, pacers cost more annually to look after and run. And then so that's one factor, is annual maintenance, but that's not the whole picture, because there was a general feeling that the pacers were, so this is a letter from the passenger transport executive, the Tyne and Wear passenger transport executive, now Nexus, talking about the replacement of the 143 gearboxes. So even the newer pacers were really not just regular maintenance, but they were like fundamentally flawed units. So tell us about this letter and its implications.
Yeah, so basically with every build they say, we'll solve the gearbox problems, it'll be fine, kind of thing. And what this ends up with is that when the trains are introduced around regions, basically again, and with the 140s and 143s, you get horrendous reliability problems. I mean, David found an article from the Newcastle Journal from about the same period as this, 1987, when they're basically reporting on, Tyne and Wear, of course, had made its own arrangements for rail, except for the Newcastle to Sunderland line. So they had their own metro. But so basically, for those that don't know, PTEs were bodies that still exist, but with a lower profile now than they used to, that basically commissioned local rail services from British Rail through what were called Section 20 payments. And in this case as well, they had also... So British Rail had kind of convinced them in some cases as well to actually buy the vehicles themselves, or fund the vehicles themselves. And what had happened here was that, so some of the 140s went into British Rail, 143s went into British Rail's pool, if you like, which ran on non-PTE lines like, say, Whitby, or sort of to places like Cleethorpes, or kind of places like this that fall out of PTEs. And then you have trains which are running on Newcastle to Sunderland, or from sort of Leeds to Bradford, or around Manchester as well, that were owned by the PTEs. And what happened was that British Rail were actually then, they sort of, so British Rail kind of they decide that replacing the self-changing gearbox with a Voith gearbox, with basically a gearbox made by a different manufacturer.
Yeah, Voith transmissions are kind of common. You see them, I think there are some on, they're quite common in rail use, so yeah.
Well, basically, they spend... So I've seen as well the figures for this. They spend £6 million over... So they start replacing them in 1987, I think it is, and it takes till 1992 to get through the entire fleet. So there are some invoices for this in the files as well. And it costs a lot of money. And one of the things that British Rail try to do is get the PTEs to pay for their own trains.
Yeah, I think it's worth me reading. There's a fantastic... The penultimate paragraph here, which I love, which is... I'm just going to read this. Wait a minute, this is Tyne and Wear passenger transport executive, so everyone from the northeast is about to get offended because I'm going to probably end up doing like a Middlesbrough accent now. You refer in your letter to the PTE's pacer vehicles, but I must make it quite clear that they are British Rail's vehicles. We put up the money for them rather than having funding come through the S20 agreement because it was financially advantageous for us to do so. In view of the fact that they are British Rail vehicles, and because we were not involved in the specification other than livery, we consider it to be your responsibility to ensure that they achieve satisfactory levels of performance and reliability. If British Rail specified an unsatisfactory gearbox, or was provided with one which is clearly not suitable, it is up to British Rail to rectify the situation regardless of what service the vehicles are used on, and to be responsible for all contractual aspects and financial liabilities. I love the idea of, they're not bloody our vehicles, you rotters. Yeah, we didn't have anything to do with specifying this junk. That's basically what that paragraph says, and I love it. I love it so much.
And they end up, basically what happens is that Tyne and Wear argued that British Rail are failing in their contractual obligation to provide a service from Newcastle to Sunderland. So bad it is.
I know.
And they end up trying to take them to court. So they nearly take British Rail to court over this. I need to look a bit further into that, as to how far that actually gets. But the fact that it got bad enough that they're kind of saying, well, basically, and these are public sector bodies arguing with each other, right? But basically, they're saying, well, this is council taxpayers' money. This is a public body backed by
And what was interesting in in the presentation you gave was someone talked about the West Midlands Passenger Transport Executive, and the fact the West Midlands Passenger Transport Executive didn't want to know. They had absolutely zero interest in the Pacers. They clearly, someone within the organisation had come from a background where they looked at it and they just thought, that's junk. We aren't having that anywhere near our system. And so that was a really interesting interjection from someone who attended the presentation you gave. That was quite interesting, getting that history there. So the next thing we're going to skip on to, because it's already 8:30, is the Serpil report, right? So everyone says, Serpil was going to close railways, and this is again cited as Abbott, and the Pacers stopped it happening. But the reality is, and I'm kind of putting words into your mouth, but yourself and David both make this case very, very kind of clearly. The political reality was that the idea that railway lines were going to be able to be closed at this point was just for the birds. That ship had sailed. So much political capital had been spent on indeed the battle to close the Settle Carlisle, which failed incidentally. So much political capital had been spent that Portillo had fought to save it. It had gone. No one was interested in closing railway lines anymore. That had gone. So the idea that there were railways that needed saving is sort of, it doesn't stand up to scrutiny, does it?
Yeah, there's relatively little interest in it actually. There's some fear that the PTEs will decide to take their money out and put it into buses, but that's reversed after bus deregulation, really. So the PTEs, a lot of them managed their own bus fleets before deregulation because they'd inherited the old municipal operators.
Yep.
But then they're kind of told, you must sell them off. So they do, obligingly. That's another story. But then what they do to kind of concentrate their power is get into rail a lot more. So the idea that railways are under threat in the 80s is really a little bit kind of fanciful, I think, because there isn't much evidence of this. Because the government know it's kind of a vote loser, really.
Yeah.
So even
they've been through that pain. They don't. Where's the klaxon when I need it? The whole furore around beaching and the first reshaping report was that the amount of capital, the amount of energy spent by governments and votes lost and the changing of the kind of electoral map as a result of that, they didn't want to go through that again. By the time Serpil is coming out, they were kind of towards the end of a kind of a long period of concern. It wasn't happening. But the other thing that's interesting is even if that was on the cards, British Rail had looked at what that would mean in terms of changing the amount of rolling stock required. And I think, and you kind of drew this point, that if they closed all these lines, so, all of these extra lines that potentially could be closed as a result of Serpil, then it basically resulted in only a marginal benefit in terms of rolling stock. There'd be a reduction in fleet requirement of kind of less than 100 vehicles, which isn't actually very much at all.
Yeah, because you might lose local authority funding even, or PTE funding that sustains a line, but then something like Inverness to Kyle, you get a train every hour, or not every hour, every 4 hours or something rather, and it needs one DMU. So a lot, so a lot of these lines, they really don't actually require that many trains to run them. Probably Llandudno to Blaenau Ffestiniog probably has one train on at a time. I don't know.
Yeah,
but same thing to Matlock. Certainly that did go in the end, of course, but certainly that's like 6 miles, so it doesn't require 100 it doesn't require hundreds of DMUs. So the point here as well is that it's 100 new vehicles, but about 600 vehicles overall are commissioned.
Yeah.
Right. So this is the thing. It's and that's including sprinters. So so there's about 170 odd Pacers, I think, something like that at the very most, and then the rest are sprinters. But that's the thing, is that the numbers that were needed to keep the system going were still high. And this is the thing, that the emphasis switches from increasing productivity by closing lines really to increasing productivity by trying to run lines more efficiently.
Yeah. You had the regional railways turned it into an art form, you could say. They really did do a good job, and provincial and they were having their own issues with the fact the sprinters the sprinters did have issues. They weren't perfect units. There were some serious issues on some of the sprinters, particularly the 158s when they came in. And the 158s were also hugely delayed, which caused them a lot of headaches. But by the time the 158s were starting to bed in, they were, they were becoming a success story. The other point, of course, in all this is that if pacers saved railway lines, why did railway lines still close? Because some railway lines did close for various reasons, and so the Matlock line there is a good example of that. They did close. Rural railways did close, and why didn't pacers save those? Which just shows that the idea that pacers had anything to do with the destiny of any railway lines in the country is nonsense. It just does not hold up to scrutiny. Anyway, there we go. So, and the last bullet point is the funniest one, I think, which is that for the most part, actually it's about 50-50, I think you said, is that the pacers were being used on sort of high or medium density suburban and urban services, not rural railway lines anyway.
Yeah. So this is the thing, is that, a good proportion of that fleet are bought by the PTEs, and that's why it becomes a big legal issue. Or funded by them, or, the 141's originally a commission basically by the West Yorkshire PTE. Right? So, British Rail do a sweetheart deal with them. We all reduce your subsidy. So it kind of, so actually, so they may have run on some, regional lines, and they ran, in the Blackpool lines and in the Cardiff Valleys, so there wasn't a PTE, and in the West Country, but a lot of the kind of so a lot of the political pressure around them and that kind of thing that I referred to earlier, a lot of it comes from the fact that, these trains are running services in Manchester and Leeds areas, in the Sheffield area, that should have been ran by much longer trains.
Yeah.
Because what also starts to happen, of course, as a result of the kind of the new policies from provincial, is that people start to use the trains a lot more.
Yeah, there's the change in policies, various policies, making rail better, fundamentally better, more accessible, meant more passengers came in, and so these things started constraining demand. Even outside of the PTs, you talk, the Welsh valleys and even the southwest, even the skippers are actually running in suburban. In a lot of cases, they're actually operating not particularly rural lines at all. They're operating kind of semi-rural kind of, or even suburban services. And the reason that, and you talked about this, I think, in the presentation, they didn't find their way up to Scotland because actually they were just, the idea of them actually successfully running a rural railway service, they're not actually good enough to run proper rural services.
Well, Highland, the 140, they put it onto some of the Highland lines, and Highland Council basically told them it was a no-go because it didn't have enough luggage space to carry rucksacks and things like that. So apart from the fact that I don't know for sure, I doubt a pacer could handle the West Highland line because it's one of the most difficult lines in the country, I believe.
I'd love to see it try. That'd be fun.
But apart from that, the actual kind of ability to handle heavy luggage and this kind of thing that these lines require is actually quite limited, and that's one of the kind of competitive advantages the train has on these lines. Even though it may still be the case that ferrying everybody by helicopter would be cheaper, but
people are pointing out that on the Sinfin line that British Rail were basically just they didn't officially close it, but they just paid for taxis for everyone who was running it, and it was actually cheaper than running the unit. That does say something about the ridership. Although you could argue that if they improved the service, more people would use it. Anyway, so we're so late. I'm so sorry, everyone, particularly Kevin and everyone who's trying to watch this and then has given up because we're 2 hours, nearly at 2 hours. But it's important because this is a fun episode and there's loads of data to crunch through, and actually it's been worth every minute, so I don't regret anything. So we get to the point, so did pacers save any rural railways? The answer is no. I just don't see how anyone can come to the end of this and argue for any of the lines on the country in any way that pacers saved rural railway lines. It just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. But are there any redeeming features of the pacer at all? Are there any? Here's a picture inside one looking kind of miserable with its bus seats. And there looks like two absolutely classic Greisers sat in this one as well. They're both with the camera straps hanging down. Anyway, not that I'm casting aspersions over the rail spotting community, the train spotting community. That would be horrible. But it's very brown inside. The thing that I hear as a positive thing is that it has big windows and you can see out. That's the only consistent. Some people like the seats. But I don't know. I've travelled in one of these with the bus seats and I bashed my head on it when it went over a bump. So I'm not a fan of the bus seats, frankly. And it just has a feeling of not. It just feels tacky inside. It just feels like you could push a panel out and your leg would be stuck out, and it just doesn't give you a feeling of comfort and confidence and crash. All the things that when you get into a train, you want it to feel robust and safe.
I think that must be the 141 actually, because it's only 2 abreast.
I think it is a 141, yeah.
And not a very generous 2 abreast either. Looking at the,
it's narrow. It really is tight and cozy, isn't it? Yeah. So in terms of people pitching in, David Shepherd asked, did Pacers kill British Rail? No. They didn't. They weren't big enough a deal to do anything. It's brown. There's brown. People are shouting brown. Yes, this is very brown indeed. Anyway. There we are. I'm not sure about redeeming features. Kevin, any redeeming features you can think of?
Well, the Windows one.
Yeah, the windows. That's basically it, isn't it? They had nice big windows.
It's probably a good one. So on scenic lanes, it does work quite well for that.
Apparently, they used to steam up without much prompting. Unfortunately, though.
Yeah, but I think they're kind of suboptimal apart from that, really, compared to what you could have got.
Yeah.
What you could have won.
David Bumstead is asking about am I going to go into crash with this? No, I'm not going to touch on it other than the fact there was a crash with one of these and it just disintegrated into dust. I think it got hit by it accidentally rolled back into the path of a Virgin Class 87, I think.
Well, it was actually demolished, if I remember.
And it was Thanos. It was just turned into dust. Yes, so there we are. That's the episode. There we go. So I'm going to get rid of our faces while I do the closure before we go back to our big faces and we say some thanks to Kevin. So very briefly, in audio only form, I hope that's all right. I don't know how well this one worked in audio only form because it's very visual and lots of data, but I'm sure we got the point across. I read some things in a very much a smoggy accent. It wasn't a Tyne and Weir accent, I know, but I default into Middlesbrough because I don't know why. Because I watched a lot of Shooting Stars, I think. Anyway, so yes. Audio only form. You can access all good podcasting platforms. Patreon, do support me on the Patreon. It allows these to happen. It makes them happen. Patreon.com/Gareth Dennis. Also, do click. This always feels weird to say. Do click the like and subscribe button. We've been sat at 4,500 subscribers to the channel for ages now. Do that and tell your friends to do that as well. GarethDennis.co.uk/Discord for the Discord server where all the fun happens, and also PayPal. You can chuck me pennies on there if you so fancy it. So, what's next? What's the next episode? The next episode, it's a goodie. It's episode 63 of Rail Natter is going to be the Williams-Shapps plan for rail, officially out of embargo in an hour and 20 minutes, aka what the hell happens next. That's the episode title. So we're going to go through. I'm going to page turn. It's going to be a page turn. We've done a lot of page turns recently, but that's because I had a backlog of interesting reports to go through. This is probably the most interesting and important page turn Rail Natter has ever done thus far. So it's going to be interesting.
It's not looking good, given that they've already released the type font. So if that's the most important feature of it, then it's really not looking good. I mean, strategy is not type font. That's ridiculous. That's the last thing they should be thinking about.
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's a very good point, Kevin. Kevin, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on. I know we've been brewing this one up for ages, but it's been really. I hope that was all right for you. I had a lot of fun. I enjoyed that. We finally gone through Pacers and eviscerated them. Hopefully. Mm-hmm. It was good stuff. What's your so is there a paper? Are there any publications people can expect to see coming off the back of this? What's next for this sort of fun little project?
Yeah, it'll probably take a couple of years, but hopefully have at least hoping I have one paper, maybe probably 2 out of it. There's enough to talk about. I think there's quite a lot to talk about here.
Yeah, well, 2 hours worth of Rail Natter is a good indication of volume. And if any viewers have information that you want to send to Kevin, then I'm sure you can do that. I'm sure Kevin wouldn't mind if you've got your own sort of archive or interesting tidbits. Do send those through. I'm sure that'd be useful. Kevin, it only really remains for me is sort of say a deep thanks from all of the Rail Natter community for a fantastic episode. There's a lot of your own hard and Dr. David Turner, if you're still watching this, I don't know if you will be, but you might watch and catch up. David, if you're watching, thanks for the work that both of you, Kevin and David, the work both of you put into this, because it's a really fascinating project. It's really interesting because myth busting is important work. You're doing the Lord's work. And I think lots of people saying they had a lot of fun in this episode. Richard Smith saying this was such a good episode. There you go.
Yeah, thanks for having me on as well, because it makes a change, yeah.
It's it's good. It's fun to. It's possibly not the most conventional form of research project dissemination, but anyway.
It's good. It's a good form. Yeah. Should do more of it.
Yes, well, this is it. Next project. We'll have to talk behind the scenes as to what the next Rail Natter kind of business history crossover is going to be. Anyway, it might well be tram related, incidentally. Anyway, right, enough of this. Everyone from both me and Dr. David, I've got both of you in my head. I'm going to say both of you. No, Dr. Kevin Tennent and I are both waving to say cheerio.
Bye.
Cheerio, everyone. Cheerio.
Yeah, everyone. Bye.